Are you serious about planning a successful business exit? From Angel to Exit is your go-to resource. Subscribe to our newsletter at eckfeldt.com/podcast for even more valuable insights. And to get personalized guidance, take our free exit readiness assessment. It's just 24 questions, and it will give you a clear picture of your exit readiness. Find the assessment at eckfeldt.com/exit. Submit your results, and we'll schedule a free follow-up call to discuss your specific situation and the best way to maximize your valuation and ensure a successful transaction. Now, back to the episode. Welcome, everyone. This is From Angel to Exit. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm your host. My guest today, Jeff Korn. Jeff is an exited entrepreneur. We're going to hear about his company, Virtuance, the experience he had building the company and then actually getting acquired. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Jeff's got a lot of interesting kind of stories and background here, and I think we're going to get a lot of good takeaways for our listeners in terms of what to think about, what to prepare for before you actually think about an exit, before you get into an exit process, and some of the takeaways that will be helpful. So with all that, Jeff, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Bruce. Excited to get into it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Before we talk about the company and obviously the exit, I'd love to get a little background. Like, how did you get into business? Did you in kindergarten you knew you were going to be an entrepreneur and start a company? What was your backstory on this?
Yeah, for sure. I wouldn't say that I knew I was going to be an entrepreneur in kindergarten, although looking backwards, maybe there were some signs, right?
Some tells.
I joked that I had like multiple careers before I was 25. My dream was always to be a television reporter of all things. And so starting at the age of like 14, 15, I did everything you need to do to kind of start to build a resume around that, internships and all the, volunteering in lots of free work, let's say, in TV studios and everything else. And then in college, I focused on that a little bit, although the school I went to didn't have a program for it. But I got a job. I got a job with ABC News in New York during school and shortly thereafter, and thought, I've got it made. This is my life. It's amazing and great. Decided I wanted to be on air, and they moved me. They said, well, we've got a possible opening in St. Joseph, Missouri, or Bangor, Maine, right? So I was like living in New York City, right? And I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to go to either Bangor, Maine, or St. Joseph, Missouri.
I love it.
I chose St. Joseph, Missouri. And anyway, long story short, I did it for about a year, and amazing, incredible experience, but realized really quickly that this wasn't how I wanted to spend my life. And I can tell you all the reasons for that, but it's another conversation.
Different podcast.
What I realized is that I was spending a lot of my time on economic development, and in a tiny little town, that meant real estate development. And so I started spending a lot of time with real estate developers and real estate folks, and loved the business, just loved everything about it, and ended up leaving the station, moving back to Denver, where I'm from. Went to business school with a focus on finance and real estate development. Worked for a real estate firm, for a couple different firms for a few years, doing medical office development and office investment. And it was then that I had this sort of epiphany, if you will, that a lot of entrepreneurs tend to have, which is that there was a better mousetrap that could be built around how real estate was marketed. And so that was sort of what led me to saying, after 5 or 6 years in that real estate development game, that I was actually going to take the leap and start a company around this. I skipped over some of the other entrepreneurial adventures I had along the way. There's always little things, right? In college, I had a number of different ventures, nothing that was game, world changing in any regard. But then I did start a consumer products company. I was kind of moonlighting that when I was doing real estate development, and I got out of it after just a couple of years. I just didn't have the energy to do both. My partner in it went on to have some great success with that.
Good.
So founded Virtuance though in 2010, and teamed up with a guy who I went to grad school with. He was sort of the artistic genius, the creative genius behind it. And I was approaching it much more from the real estate component. So I brought this real estate, expertise or at least experience, and he brought this artistic and creative element. And that was how we got started.
Did you feel like you were kind of knowledgeable, successful, capable as an entrepreneur before starting Virtuance, or like what in terms of your entrepreneurial experience, how was it landing for you so far?
Yeah, right. let's just say that I had no idea what I was getting myself into, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, it's probably somewhat of a typical story if you're not a third or fourth time founder. But, I remember, so to give you a little bit about the business, and I'm sure we'll get into it in a minute, but
Yeah.
in the early days, we would measure our success by how many photo shoots are we doing in a week. And
Okay.
I remember having a very simple, spreadsheet where I mapped out, in our first few months, if we could do 50 photo shoots in a week, we have it made, I did the math, and this is amazing. It's just me and my co-founder. And that was the goal. It's like, if we just do 50 photo shoots a week, then this can be a real thing, it's amazing. And that was the goal. And so it's just funny kind of looking back on that, because obviously you asked, what did I know? Well, I had no idea. I didn't know anything. We weren't even factoring in, what does it take to actually scale a company? Technology development was like nowhere on our radar. It was literally just, we are two young, passionate, capable, and hardworking guys who think that we have an idea that they could do something. And no, I mean, I went to business school, but I'll tell you what, it's not a knock on business school, but, I learned, it was a 15-year journey that was just, call it a PhD in business, call it whatever you want, learned so much more just by doing than by sitting in a classroom. So
Yeah, 100%.
Long story short, no, had no clue what I was getting myself into.
But yet you did it anyway.
What's that? Yeah, did it
But
anyway.
yet you did it anyway. Yeah.
Along the journey where I thought, oh my gosh, if I had known what I know now, I never would have done this, frankly, right? And that's not to say you shouldn't do it, but there are times in that journey where you kind of look at yourself in the mirror and say, what the heck? How did I get myself into this, right?
Yeah. What was the original thesis? Like, what was the problem that you saw in the market that you were trying to solve? Like, where did you see the opportunity?
Yeah, so it started out when I was working for a small real estate development firm in Denver. And part of my role at that firm was to, we were sourcing and raising money for deals, and then we were going out and building them or acquiring them. Yep. And part of my role in that was, after we would acquire them, I was responsible for marketing the property, right? We obviously need to get the property tenanted or sold. Yep. And that process, I went through, a handful of times before I realized that this was so broken. And the process looked like I would make a phone call to a photographer and say, we just acquired this building and we're trying to tenant it, and we need photos of it. And they would say, okay, no problem. They'd be maybe 3 or 4 weeks out. And then they would show up at the property. They'd bring an assistant or two along, and they would be at the property for 1 to 2 days. And at the end of 1 to 2 days, they would say, okay, we'll be back in touch with you when the photos are ready. And it would be, 10 to 14 days before I'd get the photos back. And then I would get 10 or 15 photos of this property. And the photos looked amazing, but we paid anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 for those photos. Yeah. And I had no idea. I just was scratching my head. What the heck is happening in those 10 to 14 days?
Yeah, exactly. Why does it take 30 days?
You send someone out and you take photos, and then it takes 2 weeks to get them back to me, and I only get 10 photos? Like, what is happening? And so, I often think about curiosity as being a superpower of a founder. And that was what it was for me, was that I just became really curious. What is actually happening in this process? And I started asking questions. I started learning a lot more about it. And I realized that, the magic happens in the editing of the photos. Very little happens on site that is essential, although there's a lot that we could fix about the 1 to 2 days sitting on site. And that was the beginning of it, where I teamed up with my partner who had just had young kids. And so for the first time, he bought a nice camera and started getting into photography to take photos of his kids. And we were talking, over a drink one night, and we put our heads together and said, oh my gosh, there's an opportunity here. And like I said, he approached it from this creative side of saying, like, there's got to be a better way. And I approached it from recognizing the business need in the space. And so that was how we got started. And we essentially identified, we had a conviction that we could build technology that would greatly reduce the friction in this process. It was a very classic, not necessarily that sexy, but very classic case of building a better mousetrap. And, I think that we pushed really hard, and we got told no a million times by everybody and their mother. And, And we kept pushing because we had such conviction in this. And
Yeah. What were some of the objections you were getting? Like where did you find, friction or resistance in the market?
The friction and resistance in the market came from the fact that, the technology wasn't quite where it needed to be, for one. We had this idea that, the market's saturated. This is the way it's been going on for so long. There's nothing better about what you're doing here. The idea that, if we present a product at a much lower price point, there's no way that there could be the value there. People are so accustomed to paying what they're paying because they expect a good product. If we rush through the process and we do it too quickly, the quality's not going to be there. I mean, on and on and on. And it just didn't make any sense to us. It didn't make any sense. And a lot of it was, just this idea that people have been doing things a certain way, and that's the way they would always be done. And we saw opportunity in that.
Yeah, familiarity. And I guess when you founded the company or when you started this whole journey, did you have visions? I'm going to sell this thing someday for a whole bunch of money, or what were your expectations early?
No chance. I mean, I think at a certain point you start to have those realizations that, wow, we're actually building something of value. Yeah. But that was 7, 8, 9 years later. When we started, I'm picturing as we speak, I'm picturing myself waking up and being at my desk at 7 a.m. I was single. I was 26. I was living by myself. And that was my goal. I said, I just need to be up at my desk at 7 a.m. making phone calls. That's my job right now. And I would, most of the time I'd be sitting in my underwear. This was before the days of video calls. Yeah. and that was it. We would literally wake up. I would make sales calls from like 7 until noon every day. And then I would go out on a couple photo shoots if we had any business that afternoon. We would come back and I would edit photos from literally, 5 p.m. until 2 a.m. And the whole time we were telling people that we were faking it till we made it, right? We were telling people that we had this technology and it was amazing and there was automation happening. And the automation was my co-founder and I, up all night, just grinding to try to get these things delivered the next day. And we did that for about 3 to 5 months. And that was it. It was just up at our desk at 7. We'd go to bed at 2 a.m. and we'd do it all over again. We did that for, 3 to 5 months, give or take, before we made our first hire. And then started actually thinking a little more strategically. But to answer your question, no, it was purely about like, let's try to make a little bit of money. Let's try to deliver a service and prove that like this can work. And there were no visions of, some big exit someday at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you mentioned at some point you did, or at some point you realized, hey, I've got something here. Like when did that shift for you, or when did it kind of dawn on you, or you realize like, hey, I've got an asset here that's going to have some kind of future, and we've got growth, and I need to start thinking about where do I ultimately go with this? Like when did that first kind of cross your mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the first time that I really thought about that was when we expanded into a second city. So the way that the business worked is, we're based in Denver, and we had contracted photographers. And so those photographers in theory could be anywhere. And once we built the technology behind it so that we didn't have to do a bunch of manual automation, we were able to, in theory, hire folks anywhere. So it was about 2 years after we founded that we decided to open a second location. And our first city outside of Denver was Las Vegas. And I do remember being, on a plane, flying to Las Vegas to interview salespeople that we were going to hire there. And it's crazy to even think that that's how we used to hire people. Right. Let's get on the plane and go do an interview. But for an entry-level sales role, right? But that's what we did. And, it was our first out-of-state hire. And I remember being on that plane and thinking, wow, like once we do this, we can do it again. And then again, and then again. And that's when we saw, the trajectory from both a revenue standpoint, but really, in my mind, it was more about the people. It was like, wow, we're building an organization, and organizations have value, right? This isn't just me and my co-founder sitting in our basement in our underwear, like making sales calls anymore. So that'll be the last time I go back give you a visual of me in my underwear.
Yeah. And how did that shift things for you? Like once you kind of went from, hey, I'm just trying to hustle and get something going to like, I've got something, like what shifted for you in terms of how you approach things, questions that you asked yourself? Like what was that look?
What shifted for me, I remember, is there were certain points where I started to ask myself, what is my job? Right. And we're fast forwarding a little bit right here where, we have an organization and things are humming. But I started to realize that my job was just to be better every day than I was the day before, personally and professionally. And I realized that as soon as I was the bottleneck to this business, then we weren't going anywhere. Yeah. And so the shift for me was just thinking about the doing, right? I mean, the classic, we've all heard, working in the business versus on the business.
Yeah.
But that was really the shift for me was, you know what, I need to take a step back. I need to actually think strategically. And it sounds so easy when I say it now, but obviously balancing, how do I run a growing business? And I was very much in the business for the first, let's say 5, 6, 7 years even. Yeah. To how do I make sure that this organization is positioned well to take advantage of opportunities that are in front of it, whether that's an acquisition or anything else. And frankly, I sought out peer groups. Peer groups were a big part of my journey. And I still am incredibly bullish on peer groups for supporting founders. I got a coach. I joined organizations like EO, for example, and some other organizations that allowed me to have real conversations with people who were in similar positions. And I think that was what it was for me. I just became really hungry for interaction, for surrounding myself with communities of people who had any clue what was going on, because it was hard to find them otherwise. I think I'm sure it comes up all the time in conversations you have, but being a founder is the it's the loneliest I've ever felt. Yeah. Even though, I'm the guy at the top running this organization and everybody's looking at me. I've never felt so lonely in my life and with so few answers, frankly. At sort of those middle stages when we were starting to scale. And so that's the short answer to your question is I really sought out communities, and I think for all the mistakes I made along the way, that is one thing I did get right, is that I look back and say, if I hadn't had those communities, if I wasn't able to interact with the kinds of people I needed to and wanted to during that time, I would have remained lost and alone. And instead, not to say that I wasn't, eliminated all my challenges, but I felt like I had a community of people that understood me and that were a resource that I could go to when needed. We never raised funding. We were bootstrapped.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, what was your cap table at that point? I mean, you were still like you were 50-50 partners, or what was your structure?
So my co-founder and I were 50-50 essentially on day one. And then, once things got a little bit real, we realized we needed to build some technology here and make this real. We sought out and brought in a CTO who became a partner in the business. And so for all intents and purposes, we were a third. He had some shares that vested over 4 years, I think. Yeah. And that was what it looked like. That was the cap table. It was we all owned 33% of the company essentially after vesting. And it was, and I think the reason I mentioned that we were bootstrapped is because I can tell you all the benefits in my mind of being bootstrapped. There's obviously pros and cons to every approach. But one of the detriments of being bootstrapped is that we didn't have any formal board. We didn't have any formal advisors. And so I think a lot of founders sometimes lean on that board, especially if they're, first-time founders. They might lean on that, whether it's a board of advisors or an actual, governance board or otherwise. And we didn't have that. So I felt like I needed to seek that out.
Yeah. And how, for the three of you, like how did you kind of envision the future? Like, how did you figure out between the three of you, like, where are we taking the company? What do we want to achieve? What does success look like? Was there a process that you used to align on that? Or I'm always curious with partnerships, how you go through that process.
It's messy. I think one of the things that I didn't know that I think I know now is just how important it is to align interests up front, right? I mean, I was great friends with my co-founder. We had a lot of similar thinking. And about 2 years after we founded the company, there started to be some rifts. And you know, and the rifts were private, but they quickly became public. It's hard to hide those from the company, right? And what ended up happening, without getting into the details, is that we began a process to separate from one another about 3 years in. And it took us about 3 or 4 years from the time we realized that to really cleanly separate. What it ultimately looked like is that I bought him out. My CTO and myself bought him out about 5-6 years into the company.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that because the reality was we weren't aligned. We weren't aligned on what we wanted to do with the company. We weren't aligned on where we wanted to go. We weren't aligned on how hard we wanted to work to get there and what did that look like along the way. And so then, about 5-6 years in, it became my co-founder, my CTO and myself. And we were equal partners at that point. And there were still distinctions or differences in our own motivations. I was at that point, call it early 30s, recently married. I had my first kid right around then, and just starting out in my career for all intents and purposes. I had zero net worth, but probably negative net worth at that point. My CTO had come out of another exit a few years earlier, and he was certainly not financially motivated at that point at all. I was. And so we had a lot of discussions about, what does it look like what does the future look like? What kind of distributions are we going to take? I needed, cash flow. He didn't.
Classic.
So all of these things, and we were an LLC, so we had some flexibility in the way that we compensated ourselves and whatnot. I think, it's messy. I could go into so many stories about the details of it. He worked really hard, I think, to get me away from a scarcity mindset that I often had because I just needed some cash to run my life. And so we had a real yin and yang, and we're incredibly different people, but we were able to work really well together. It took a lot of time to learn how we operated, but I will say that communication, it's just communication. The second the communication breaks down, I think it's over, or at least, there's a lot of trouble in paradise. And it wasn't clean, it wasn't a straight line, it wasn't easy, but over many, many years, we ultimately were able to align on this idea that if we don't capitalize on what we're building, we're introducing more risk into the equation without necessarily having any benefit for that risk.
And so, a point that the two of you, or how did the two of you decide, hey, like, we do actually want to entertain some kind of exit, and like, how did that conversation come up? Were you like, what were the differences, time frame? What is that, vision for what that looked like? I'm curious when that happened.
So, there were several stages of it. I think there was a point in time where we would ask ourselves, should we raise money? And the question that we asked in order to determine what the answer to that first question was we said, are we growing too quickly or are we growing too slowly? And if the answer to either of those was yes, then we said, would money solve that problem, right? So are we growing too quickly? Okay, if the answer is yes, then we need some additional operational, funds or whatever, technology, whatever it is. If we're growing too slowly, could money, fuel our growth? And so the reason I mentioned that is because those conversations ultimately led to the conversation of, should we exit the business? And so, there was a point in time where I needed capital. I was just feeling very, I had paper equity, right? I had
exactly.
Money on paper.
I'm worth a lot of money on paper.
Nothing in a bank account. And so going back to this idea that, I was just a young broke kid and running a company, and he was an engineer who, got off on what he called, I still laugh when it says, but he always called it brain-gasms. He said, I get paid in brain-gasms. As long as I have like a brain-gasm every now and then I'm good. He's like, I don't care what the money is, And so I respect that. And it was great. The business benefited when he had a brain-gasm because that meant that we had some technical breakthrough that was magical. But but it didn't put money in my bank account. And so all that's to say, there was a certain point where I decided I wanted to go out for secondary. I wanted to raise money purely to take some chips off the table.
Yeah.
And I began that process. And that going through that process, understanding how valuations are determined, understanding, and we were talking to mostly family offices at that point.
Okay.
And what ended up happening is he stepped in, my co-founder stepped in and said, let me just solve this problem for you. And he was the buyer of my shares. And so, we maintained the same control, but the cap table shifted, and I got a little bit of cash, and he got the shares, and that process gave me some insight, but it also kind of put my head in a place where I said, wow, we could actually, exit, and I had some sense of what the value would be at that point. And so that just kind of put the idea in our head. And then interestingly enough, Bruce, it wasn't anything about the business itself that really got me over the hump. It was more personal. It was more about what was going on in my personal life. And I recognize, and what that was, I'm not afraid to say. I mean, I think the fact that my marriage, frankly, outlasted the business is nothing short of a miracle.
Yeah.
I say that with, so much respect for my wife that, I can't even believe that she put up with what she did, to be honest. The business was front and center all the time. It was in the room every single moment. And that was tough. It was really hard. We had young kids, and it was challenging. And I kept saying, in hindsight, I think I was lying to myself, but I kept saying to myself and to her that, it's going to be different when, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We're so close. Everything's going to be amazing when this happens. And it was years of that. And so, with that going on in the background and seeing, pretty phenomenal growth, but then also kind of looking around a corner and seeing that growth start to slow a little bit.
Taper just slightly, yeah.
And then combine that with where valuations were at the time that we decided to move forward. And it all just added up. It felt like the right thing. I also felt like there was a disconnect between what the business needed and what I could bring it at that time.
Yeah.
The business needed to take on significant additional risk to get to the next level. And, there's sort of these levels that you get to, and every level takes a little bit of additional, you got to take a leap to get there. And psychologically and financially, I was not in the place to be able to be the one to get us to that next leap. And so the idea of bringing in capital through an exit that would actually allow the business and our team to go to the next level was really attractive to me. And combine that with all of the backstory that I just shared, and the decision was pretty clear for me.
Yeah.
Convincing my partner at that time that was the right idea was the whole other story. And it took a lot of conversations and a lot of years, frankly, for us to align. But there was about a 3 or 4 year process where I was convinced that we should start moving in that direction. So certainly not decisions that were made on a whim.
Yeah, no, that's great, and thank you for the insights. So you made that decision, and then what did that process look like? I mean, did you have a pretty clear understanding, knowledge of okay, we're gonna run a process, we're gonna hire these people, this is what this is gonna look like, these are the potential buyers. I mean, how mapped out was that versus the reality of what you actually went through?
How do I even begin? There's really nothing that could have prepared me for what was to come when we actually went to market. But I will say that, at the time that we made the decision, we had moved the business kind of upstream, right? So, we started out working with individual realtors, right? And then we moved on to working with brokerages, regional brokerages, then national brokerages. And then we had opportunities to work with, big capital like hedge funds and real estate portals, household names, people you would know.
Yeah.
And it was when we moved from, these mom and pops up to having real enterprise level customers, it was easier to see how, who an acquirer could be. Yeah. For example, we had partnerships that we had worked with for a long time with well-funded, public companies. And it felt like, okay, there's a path here. That said, that's not exactly how it went. So happy to get into more detail to the extent we want to go there.
Yeah, I'd like to. What I'm trying to figure out, or what's always interesting for me, is what did you anticipate, right? How did you think it was going to go, and what did you feel like you needed to do to prepare for that? and then what actually happened, and where did you either get caught off guard, or you realize like, oh, like it wasn't gonna be like that, it was gonna be like this, and I wish I would have done this, or I wish I would have thought about this a little bit more. Because I always find that like this prepping for the exit, it's where some of the challenges are, because people haven't been through it. So it's like, how do I prepare for this thing I've never done before, and I don't know really what's going to happen, so how do I get myself ready for it? I'm curious about that sort of psychology for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two pieces. One is very practical, right? What do you need to do to prepare for an exit from a business standpoint? And the other that I think is more to your question and more important is the psychology around it. And I would say, gosh, I didn't anticipate the roller coaster. I thought, oh, we're at the end. This is the end. We've made it. Now we're gonna sell, and it's gonna be great. And the reality is that, I mean, I don't know that there's anything that could have prepared me for the roller coaster. But if I were advising anybody who's going through the process, and I've had the opportunity to be in that position now with a couple companies, I would say that it's way easier said than done, but whatever I could do to maintain optionality and not get get wrapped around the axle with this specific outcome would have benefited me. We closed the transaction by the skin of our teeth in many regards, and I think a lot of transactions are like that. I thought it would be this straight line. Here's the process. Go here, then here, then here, then here. And on paper, it looks great. And in reality, it was a bumpy ride, very bumpy, to the point where, many, many times in that process, we thought there's no chance. There's no way this is happening. It's all over. We've got to go back to the drawing board. And the thought of that was so devastating to me, devastating. Oh. And I think that, not that you asked it, but the advice I would provide, or what I think I know based on going through it, is that, obviously nothing's done until it's done, but as soon as you are so committed to a specific outcome, you've lost the game. And it's so hard to implement in practice. But if our transaction had not ended up closing and having a positive outcome, I really do, I wonder, where I would have been psychologically and mentally, and I wonder what I could have done differently in order to make sure that I was fine either way. We've been running this business for 12 years, and it was profitable, and we were making money. Everything was great, other than the personal side that I told you about, and so again, I mean, not a straight line, very bumpy, rocky road. Nothing's done till it's done. And I didn't appreciate that. I really didn't.
Yeah. I think, having done lots of these interviews and my own exit, and having worked with a lot of founders through exits, that's generally the case, right? There's very rarely do you have this kind of clean, methodical exit. There's always bumps, there's always drama, there's always like last minute, are we actually going to close this thing? And just knowing that, just kind of going into it with the expectation that that's going to happen can be helpful. And you mentioned something I would love to kind of dig into a little bit, which is the whole idea of the optionality. Like when you say you wish you had out of optionality, give me more, like what would optionality have looked like in that situation for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I have the opportunity to be in communities now where I talk to and work with a lot of founders, and it's amazing to me how many, a vast majority, I would say, of early stage founders are thinking about an exit already. And I tell them, an exit is just one option, right? Like there are, that's the beauty of being an entrepreneur. You have so many options in front of you, and you can decide. And I think that the biggest value, I'm a huge fan of maintaining optionality anywhere I can. However, I didn't do it in this case. And I think that, what do I mean? I mean that, look, selling is one choice. For me, in the situation I was in, we had plenty of options, even though I wasn't able to see them because I had these blinders on looking at the exit. But the options could have been, I could have brought in a CEO, right? And somebody who, and you got to put your ego aside for that, and you got to, decide, are you psychologically going to be able to let go of whatever? But I could have exited the business and still had owned it. And what else? We could have brought in minority. We could have, done an employee sale, over many years if we wanted to. We could have continued to operate the business and just not do it at the same growth trajectory, right? And obviously that would take a hit to our value, but it would improve cash flow. And so, I mean, there's a lot of options and none of them are so bad, right?
Yeah.
And I just had it in my head that we're selling and it's going to close and that's it. And if not, it's all over.
Yeah.
And that was so far from the truth at that moment.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean when I talk about optionality.
Yeah, no, they're good. Yeah, and I think the irony in this is that I find that founders that go into this process with real options, and then some are definitely better than others. It's not like I have, 3 amazing options, but I've got options, end up getting better deals, right? Because they can negotiate from a much kind of stronger place, or at least not from a place of kind of panic. And, as you mentioned, it's like, I've got to get it. I've got to sign this deal, because if I don't sign this deal, I don't know what's going to happen. That's not a great place to negotiate from.
Absolutely. And I think we were able, we did have options. I just psychologically wasn't able to really see them. I think, all's well that ends well. So it's easy to say now. But I think optionality is something that I think a lot about in business. I always advise founders on optionality and not to think about things in a binary way, like it's yes or no. It's like there's always some middle ground. There's always ways to work things out, and it's easier to see the forest for the trees when you're not going through it.
Yeah. And I mean, I know the exit was financially successful, but from other non-financial aspects of the exit, the terms, how things played out, what do you wish you would have done differently, or is anything that you wish would have turned out differently in terms of how the exit actually unfolded and the post-exit kind of how things played out?
Yeah, I think for all intents and purposes, it was a great outcome for us, and I feel very fortunate and lucky that we achieved it. I would say that there's a couple things that I benefited from by virtue of having my partner having gone through a large exit prior. Yeah. The first was right when we engaged a banker. The first thing that he said to the banker was, literally on the first phone call we had with the banker, he said, "We're not going to take an earnout."
Just
literally the banker, so let's talk about how we want to position, and he's like, whatever we do, no earnout. And I think that takes a banker off guard, because banker wants optionality too.
Exactly.
But he stuck to his guns, and I trusted him on that. And
why? Why did he not? Why was that a personal decision, or was that a strategic decision? Why did he not want an earnout?
Well, the reality is that we all make decisions based on our past experience. He had a bad past experience.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? And so I think that the reality is, his point of view, and one that is not unique to him. I've heard it time and time again, and it doesn't mean that earnouts are bad, but what can happen is that I'm running my business. I'm in control of everything. I feel like I know what levers I can pull to make things happen. And so when someone says, "Can you hit this revenue number next year?" I say, "Of course, I know I can do that," right? But what we don't factor in necessarily as founders is that when we're going to be trying to do that, we're living in a different environment. Somebody else is controlling those levers, not us. What happens when your budget gets cut, your sales budget gets cut, but you still need to hit a number, So it was those things that I think he was afraid of. I was uneducated. I would have said, let's do a deal that makes sense, whether it's an earnout or not. But in hindsight, it was the best thing that could have happened, frankly, because, the reality is our timing was great. I'm not gonna lie that we got really lucky on the timing. Shortly after our sale, interest rates went up considerably. And obviously that's has a huge impact on the real estate market. Real estate sales slowed dramatically, and our revenue took a hit. And so I was very thankful that we actually got a deal done that didn't include an earnout. And so that was a success. I think, the other thing, and like I said, all's well that ends well. We ended up selling to a strategic that was international. They're based in Sweden. But I think the challenge was that they didn't. There were things I took for granted going into the transaction, where's the funding coming from, right? I just assumed that if they're showing up at the table, they have the money, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's common. It's certainly not discrediting to our buyer in any way. It's just a common thing that like, you figure it out as you go along. And so they figured it out as they went along. And what ultimately needed to happen was they needed to actually do a majority recap in order to fund the acquisition. And so it ended up being a pretty classic leverage buyout for us with a PE firm. And so all's well and good. Is a great firm, and we had a good relationship. But the reason I mention it is just that it was different. It was different than what we thought going in, right? Yeah. And so it just created a lot more conversations for us internally about, is this what we want to do? Is this what we set out to do? Because some of the rules of the game changed midway.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, what do you focus on today? Like, how has this kind of played out for you? Like, what's the next chapter, or how are you focusing your time and energy?
Yeah, no, it's been a very interesting journey. I mean, it's been about not quite 2 years since I left the company. So I sold the company in 22, stayed on for a couple of years as part of the deal and beyond, and then left just not quite 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. So, I think about it in different stages, Bruce. There was this absolute pure elation, of like, I don't even need to think about what I want to do. It's just, I told people I felt like it was the first day of summer vacation as a kid, and that lasted like like a month, maybe 2 months.
That's good. Most people say it's like a week.
Yeah, no, I felt like I knew myself. I read all the books. I listened to all the podcasts about what's it going to feel like. What should I, And I kept coming back to this, this prominent sentiment that like, you get back in the game, and like you're gonna go do it again. And I was just like, no, I'm not. I don't get it. That's not me. And I think there's some truth to that. And I think I need to give myself a little credit for knowing myself and trusting that. But it wasn't entirely true. So I did that for a few months. It was just, this is fun. I don't have to do anything. I won. Freedom, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And then I went into a mode that a good friend of mine rightfully calls engineering smallness. And I love that term he put on it, because I was describing to him what I was doing. And I said, I'm doing all these things with my hands. I'm like tinkering. I built a maker space in my basement. I'm doing like 3D printing and laser cutting and CNC, and I'm learning CAD and all this stuff. And it's like so classic. He's like, oh yeah, you're engineering smallness. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, for so long you had this big thing that wasn't really so much in your control. There were so many things other people could do to screw it up or whatever. And so now it's kind of like swinging the pendulum back the other way to be like, what can I do that only I can control? Like when I'm like working on a CNC machine, like carving some wood, like no one's going to screw that up for me except me, So anyway, so I tinkered. There was a lot of tinkering that lasted for, maybe 4 to 6 months. Then I went through a phase where I said, I really want to just give back with my time. Okay. So I joined a number of boards, and I started mentoring some like high school students, and I did a lot of like free mentoring work where, none of it's about money. It was just about the love of the game and this idea of like, I think behind it was a lot of like, how do I remain relevant? And so I spent my time, I think, forcing myself to try to remain relevant. And so then I got to the place where I think is where I am now. I'm incredibly busy. A lot of what I do is I'm able to spend time on things that I truly value that I wasn't able to spend time on before. Number one is my health. I that is something that for me now is non-negotiable, and I recognize it's a luxury because I wasn't able to make it non-negotiable before. Some people can do that. I wasn't able to do it while I was grinding 80 hours a week. And the second, and at least as important, if not much more important, is my family. I've got young kids, 10 and 8 years old, and I've been able to be very conscious of the fact that these years are fleeting. And so that looks like being able to take them to school in the morning and pick them up from school and take them to their activities and spend much more quality time than I was able to before. That said, I also recognize that those things in and of themselves are not enough for me from a fulfillment standpoint. And there's a little bit of guilt in saying that, because it's like, you have health and you have family and you have money. What else do you want? But there is this desire for more. And I think, for me, the way I think about it now, Bruce, is I think about it like a spectrum. And on this side, I have absolute freedom and optionality, but very little impact. And on the other side, I lose some of that freedom and optionality, but I have a lot more impact. And what I'm trying to do now is to focus on things that are somewhere in the middle. Freedom is really invaluable. And when I say freedom, I just mean the ability to choose how you spend your time. But I am certainly a recovering workaholic, and I don't know how successfully I'm recovering. You know, I'm involved in a lot of different things now. I'm advising a handful of companies. I'm doing some of the coaching here and there. I sit on a couple boards of organizations. It's impossible in this day and age not to be obsessed with AI and everything we can do. I'm building products when I could never do that before, and I'm testing out a bunch of things. And from a financial from like a truly work standpoint, I'm still figuring that out. You know, I know that I have the entrepreneurial itch does not go away. I am the same person I always was. And, you know, I think I'm trying hard to figure out how to find joy without productivity. And that has proven to be one of the biggest challenges, frankly. You know, my wife, we kind of have what's turned into a joke where, you know, if I go into my office and sit in front of my computer, we always used to call that work. It's like, oh, you're going to work again. But now that I don't have a job, it's kind of like, well, what are you doing in there? Right?
Do we need that computer?
But it becomes the default if we don't do something different. And for a long time, I tried to fight that, Bruce. I said, why do I feel the need to do anything that's productive? But the reality is, I think I've come to terms just in the last few months with this idea that it's fun for me. It's actually fun. Yeah. And so I'm focusing my time on, so now I don't say I'm going to work. I say I'm going to go have a little bit of fun. And, I like it. And that could be going out on a bike ride, or it could be sitting in front of a computer, tinkering with some product I'm building or whatever. It's fun. And I think the North Star for me right now is when I'm working, I want to make sure I'm working on things that I really enjoy. Yeah. And so easier said than done, because anything we do, there's going to be some minutia and all the things that are challenging and frustrating. But I'm a lifelong learner. I'm incredibly curious. That doesn't change. And so all of that is a long way of saying, I don't know what I want to do when I grow up, Bruce, but I know that it's not going to be just sitting on a beach, because that's just it's not really fulfilling to me. Yep. And I also, you know, as much as some things change, most things don't. I still have a young family, right? And I have the same responsibilities I've had, exit or no exit. Yeah. I still have the same psychological makeup, exit or no exit. Yeah. And so anyway, long way of saying I'm really busy. I have not been bored for 1 second, but I'm trying to, you know, make sure I can find joy in some kind of balance, which I didn't have before.
Yeah. I find a lot of exited entrepreneurs, right? Like go through that. I mean, they kind of, no one's going to retire, right? The entrepreneurs that I know that exit, like no one wants to sit on the beach. No one's like, they'll play golf for like a couple of weeks, and then they'll be like, oh yeah, this is boring. And I think the bigger picture, you know, for me has always been, right, it's a huge power that you have as an entrepreneur to create, you know, value, to create opportunity for people, to create, you know, improve society, improve culture, right? Like I think there's a certain kind of almost obligation we have as exited entrepreneurs to, you know, give back, not just in terms of money, but in terms of, you know, time, energy. Let's create the next thing, right? Let's create, you know, improvement in the world. And I think that's, you know, I think it's powerful, right? And I think there's a real opportunity for exited entrepreneurs because, yes, you don't have the financial needs anymore, but you have an opportunity to really kind of do great things. So, you know, highly encourage people to do that. And I'm excited that you're still in there kind of figuring out what the next thing is and where you want to go with that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's in our DNA. I think, you know, it's funny because I talk to some of my friends who are not entrepreneurs, and they look at me and shake their head. They're like, what are you doing? Why are you working? What's happening? You know, what? And, you know, all I can say is either you get it or you don't. And there's no judgment if you don't get it, but there's a certain DNA. I can't sit still for very long. I'm working on that, but I've been working on that my whole life. And I know I'm not alone in that. So, you know, it's a journey. What I love about it is that the exit allowed me to see something that I wasn't able to see before. And that is that I am very clear now that there's no destination. Yeah. It's all the journey. There is no destination. And I recognize that somebody listening to me say that could say, well, sure, it's easy for you to say that now. Yeah. And that they would be totally right. Because I don't know if I wouldn't have been able to say that before the exit. Yeah. But I know now if an exit, if that level of quote unquote success can't make me feel like I've arrived, then what I know is that nothing will.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And that's been the biggest unlock for me, honestly. As ironic as it is that I've unlocked this idea that I will now have for the rest of my life that there's no destination. Yeah. And that it's a pretty beautiful thing. I mean, when I think about it, because it allows me in theory to find more joy in the doing and the things that are happening in the present, as opposed to what's going to go on tomorrow or the next day. Yeah. So, it's easy to say. I'm still learning to embrace that, but I think that's been honestly the biggest unlock of the whole thing is just that we're never going to arrive. Right? Yeah. It's all a journey.
Yeah. Jeff, this has been a pleasure. Some great conversation. I love where we landed this. I think it's a really great takeaway and hopefully a great insight for folks that are listening here. If people want to find out more about you, what's the best way to get that information?
LinkedIn is probably the best. I'm not super active on social. So yeah, I would say LinkedIn is the best way to find me.
All right, cool. Make sure that link is on the show notes here so we can get that. Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really great conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bruce, for having me. It's always fun to get into it. So thank you.